So, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to today's QAA Scotland seminar. We're delighted to have so many of you join us today, when we're going to be having a conversation about where in the world is enhancement and exploring the international impact of Scotland's enhancement approach. We've got a fabulous panel of colleagues with us today to help us steer through some of the really critical questions in this space, and a superb set of colleagues joining us for the session today. So please do make sure to participate as fully as you wish and use the chat box to put in any questions or comments as we go along, and we will make sure to incorporate as many of those as possible into our conversation. So this is the second panel of the 20 Years of Enhancement campaign. So this is a campaign that is marking the 20th year of Scotland's enhancement-led approach to quality. So as part of this, we're running a really rich programme of activities and events, including this seminar series. And you can find that link to that full programme in the chat box, and please do come along to any sessions that you can. It's going to culminate in our conference in June, and it will be our 5th International Enhancement Conference, and will be held at Glasgow Caledonian University, and we hope many of you will attend. I'd particularly like to thank everyone who submitted a proposal. We've got a huge number have been submitted this year, really high quality proposals, and we really appreciate all of the time that people have put into developing those. So that is what's happening across the next few months, and we hope you'll be part of that conversation. The conversation today is focusing specifically on where in the world is enhancement and the international impact of our enhancement approach. So I'm Professor Martha Caddell from Heriot-Watt University, and I'll be chairing today's session. I'll be joined by a fantastic panel of colleagues. We've got Professor Diane Grayson, who's joining us from South Africa, Padraig Walsh, who's joining us from Ireland, and Andrée Sursock, who's joining us from Iceland. So a wonderful selection of colleagues to join us today. So I would like us to explore in this session how the lessons from Scotland's enhancement approach is being used and implemented to embed quality enhancement in their particular international, tertiary and university sectors. We're also looking forward to discovering how we can learn from your context and apply that to our institutions and to our sector approach here in Scotland. So without further preamble, let me ask our panelists to introduce themselves and a little bit about your institution and how you first got involved in this enhancement approach. So can I turn to you first, Diane, and ask you to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much. So my position at the moment is Senior Director Academic Affairs at Wits University of the Witwatersrand, which just turned 100 last year. We're a research-intensive university of about 40,000 students in Johannesburg. And I have overall responsibility for teaching student learning and success and quality in the institution, where I am now applying what I had learned previously when I worked for our National Quality Assurance Agency, the CHE, and I was employed there to figure out a way to work with the entire higher education sector to improve teaching, learning and student success, which is when I turned to QAA Scotland, initially in 2013, and came out, in fact, to your International Enhancement Conference in 2013 and met Claire and other members of QAA and had extensive involvements for the next 5 years with QAA Scotland and stole a lot of ideas. Thank you.
Brilliant. So we'll be very interested in which of those ideas have stuck and how you've developed them. So look forward to you joining the conversation. Thanks, Diane. Padraig, can I turn to you and hear a little bit about QQI as well?
Thanks very much, Martha, and delighted to appear here today. I'm Padraig Walsh. I'm the Chief Executive of the National tertiary quality qualifications agency, QQI. Obviously, we're Celtic cousins with Scotland and our friends everywhere except on a rugby pitch, and certainly won't be in a couple of weeks' time as we both vie for the Grand Slam, hopefully. I was a member of the QAA Scotland Committee for 2 terms from 2007 to 2013. So I'm very familiar with the enhancement themes as were there. At that time, I was Chief Executive of the Irish University Quality Board, one of the antecedent bodies to QQI. So I go back to the Norman Sharp days in QAA Scotland, and I've had a long involvement with colleagues, and in fact that continued up to relatively recently when Ailsa Crone, one of your directors, was on one of our committees as well. And we also have an MOU with QAA, so we work very closely together. So delighted to join you today.
Wonderful. And that historical perspective, that sense of change across the Scottish sector as well as across the Irish sector, be fantastic to hear more of that as we step through, Padraig. So thank you so much. And for our final panelist today, Andrée Sursock, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Marta, and good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. I actually first heard about the enhancement framework in Scotland 20 years ago. I was at the conference in Spain, and Elsa Crum presented the approach, a new approach that was developed in Scotland, and it resonated very much with me at the time. I was from between 2001 and 2009 the head of the institutional evaluation program at the European University Association. And this program was very much enhancement-led. I really appreciated very much the title that you've chosen for this session, Where in the World is Enhancement? At the time of I think 20 years ago, enhancement was a bit everywhere in quality assurance. And then Europe drifted toward more of an accreditation and the control type of quality assurance. But there were a few holdouts. And the few holdouts were Scotland, Ireland, Finland, EUA, and a few other countries. I got involved in Iceland through Norman Sharp, who had been asked by the government in Iceland to develop a Scottish-like framework for Iceland. And so I got involved in 2015, first as an observer and then as a board member, and now as the chair, succeeding Norman in the role. So I'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about it later, but for now, I think that's a good introduction. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to see that intertwining of the personal connections and the institutional connections that we've been able to build up over the last 20 years. And I think that's something I'm sure colleagues around the table here will be able to kind of resonate with. So our enhancement approach is so much about the personal connections and the personal learning that we're able to develop, as well as that really significant institutional and sector-wide change that is generated. So perhaps we'll reflect on that as we step through. Can I ask, though, just as we kick off our conversation, to step back and look at the kind of national context that we're working in. So Scotland's been operating our enhancement-led approach as articulated in the Quality Enhancement Framework for 20 years, hence our celebrations. I'd be very interested in how your national approach to quality enhancement differs or relates to the Scottish model. So you've all drawn on it, but how is that actually articulated at the national level at the moment? What's similar and what's different? Padraig, would you like to kick off on this one?
As I was mentioning earlier, I had been involved from back in 2005, and I was very interested in going over to Scotland and talking to Norman Sharp, who was the head of QAA Scotland at the time, about the approach that had been taken there, because we've a very autonomous university system here, and we've just got new legislation on quality assurance. And it was always interesting trying to balance the roles, recognizing that you need a regulatory element when you do reviews. There's an expectation of an accountability piece, but that when you're dealing with a relatively small number of institutions, you're really only looking at doing evaluations every 6 or 7 years. And we just felt that that was just too big a distance for engagement. So we introduced a series of dialogue meetings, which actually borrowed from the Scottish framework, where I went out to the institutions to talk to them. We used to do it on an annual basis. We've now so many institutions, because we're a tertiary system, that we do that every 2 years. But we also introduced a system of annual quality reports, and we balanced the reporting in there between a regulatory or reporting element and an open space really for the institutions to tell us about quality enhancement and what they're doing to enhance quality. We do a synoptic digest of those reports, which are published every year, and highlight particular case studies that might be of interest to people. And we've now set that up as a database of features of good practice. So if you like, we still have our cyclical reviews, but we have this other dimension, which really is focusing on the quality enhancement side. So there are certain similarities, obviously there.
That's super. Diane, what's the context in South Africa like? How have you got that balance between the assurance and enhancement?
So quality, well, having a national quality body is fairly new in South Africa. We only had our first democratic elections in 1994, and our National Quality Assurance Agency, their founding document was only written in 2000. And so at the beginning, the emphasis was very much on assurance, and we did a round of institutional audits. And it was at the end of that cycle, when I was hired in 2012, where the external evaluation of our audit process said, look, it was good, we needed to do it, we were a highly unequal society and system, but now we need to move towards enhancement. We need to work as a sector and bring the whole sector up together. We can't just work with individual institutions like BITS that are 100 years old when we have others that are 7 years old and far more poorly resourced. So we had this intense period where I was driving the quality enhancement project, and a bit later I'll tell you about some of the things we particularly liked that we stole from you. But that enhancement approach was tremendously beneficial for the sector, because it evened out some of the inequalities in terms of how we related one to another, which is what you mentioned earlier, how the relationships are so important. So it allowed us to have more equal relationships in an unequal society. The National Quality Assurance Body, which I don't work for now, as I said, I work at BITS, is now going to be introducing a new quality assurance framework, which is going to be a balance, actually, of assurance and enhancement. And that will come in from 2024.
That's fascinating. That notion of equality and the equal relations in an unequal society, I think, is something maybe we want to come back to. And it would be interesting to get other colleagues' reflections on that in terms of the tertiary sectors that you're operating in as well, I think, and wider society that we're operating in. So thanks for that, Diane. Andrée, any comments or kind of developments from your side in terms of how are you adopting and adapting the new national approach?
Well, the thing to remember about Iceland is that it's a very small country with about 350,000 inhabitants. And so when the government decided to establish a body for quality assurance, from what I understand, they went around Europe and then targeted Scotland as a model for themselves, contacted Norman Sharp and asked Norman to form a board and then to come up with a framework that would be fit for a purpose and for the size of Iceland. So the quality enhancement framework in Iceland is very much inspired by the Scottish framework. It has some of the same components, with some, some limitations because of the size of the country. So the four major components are the subject-led reviews, which are the responsibility of the universities, the institution-wide reviews, the annual meetings, and I may come back on that and talk about how that is changing. And then the fourth component is the Quality Council. The Quality Council is not quite like it's not quite the Enhancement Committee in Scotland, but it includes all the quality officers in the universities. One major difference between Scotland and Iceland is the composition of the board. I think that there is a major difference there, but I'm not that familiar with the details of the Scottish arrangements. But the board in Iceland includes Scottish members, and we really have continued to make sure that our Scottish roots are recognized in the board membership. By the way, the next chair, the one succeeding me after in June, is going to be someone from Scotland, Crichton Lang. So we have Scottish members, but we also have, importantly, a Nordic member and a member from the US. Because those two regions of the world provide important benchmarks for Iceland. Icelandic, for a very long time, the PhD candidates would go to the US or to the Nordic countries to get their PhD. So, and this has continued to this day and as I said, provide very important benchmarks for us and for the universities. Our expert panels similarly always include one US expert and one Nordic expert. And that's really very systematic. It's a combination of similar components and different components. One important change that was introduced between the first and the second cycle, we're now at the end of our second cycle, so all this is still very new in Iceland, is that we have introduced the evaluation of research management in the quality in the QEF in Iceland. And in the next cycle, we will be including the third mission of universities. So we will no longer be just focusing on the teaching and learning, but also looking at other aspects of university mission that are so important actually to the quality of teaching and learning.
That's wonderful. So really interesting. I wondered, I'm really struck by something you said in your opening remarks, Andrée, about the how the kind of European-wide focus on enhancement, and how now it's maybe there's a more focused enclaves of focus on quality enhancement, and you highlighted Scotland, you highlighted Ireland within that. I'm interested, panelists, in terms of how is quality enhancement being valued by your national sector? I mean, are you having to struggle to hold on to the enhancement element of it? Is it being valued? And how is that kind of in practice stepping through? Wanda Padraig, if you want to come in on that.
Sure. I mean, one of the areas that we're responsible for is the whole area of academic integrity. And in the legislative term, we're responsible for prosecuting things like contract cheating. But we recognized at a very early stage that, to be honest, that's chasing yourself. You're talking about people that are mobile around the world, and that really the route to solving a lot of these problems is education and the institutions looking out for it themselves. So we set up a national academic integrity network, and it really followed the same type of model, of structural model, as say QAA Scotland had. We ensured that it was chaired by a senior academic from one of the universities, and that there were academic or senior representatives from the senior management responsible for quality on those issues from all of the institutions, and including students as well. So that is very much owned by the sector. We have two managers, one who has in her title Academic Integrity Regulation, and the other whose title includes Academic Integrity Enhancement. So although there is clear regulatory responsibility, we really feel that on the enhancement side, around things like the solution to a lot of the issues around contract cheating and what I call the AI squared problem, academic integrity and artificial intelligence, are about clever assessment design. And the thing to remember about assessment is assessment of all of the things related to quality. Assessment is determined by frontline academics. It's not determined by administrators on that. So we found that being able to look at things on a sector-wide basis on assessment and maintaining this national academic integrity network in a system that's very similar in size to Scotland, about 20 public institutions as well, has been very helpful for the way that we've done things. So I think that's a good example where enhancement will always trump what you can do on the regulatory or enforcement side.
Yes.
Diane, does that resonate with what your experiences are?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I learned about the Irish Academic Integrity Network because a couple of months ago, I invited someone from Dublin City University together with somebody from Swansea University to run a webinar for us on academic integrity, and particularly assessment and how we develop more authentic forms of assessment to promote academic integrity rather than trying to beat the cheats, because you never can. So yeah, I mean, that enhancement approach, I think, is definitely, it's more effective, but it's also, you know, tremendously empowering and powerful, because you can never regulate good behavior, really. And it also, obviously, you know, it encourages collaboration, which is my big thing at the moment, you know, empowering people to work together and feel a sense of agency in whatever role they play.
What has that looked like, Diane, in terms of, you know, I guess back to your very evocative comment about equality and in an unequal context? How is that kind of, that enhancement approach and the conversations that opened up looked like?
Yeah, so maybe I can go back to when we launched the Quality Enhancement Project, and Claire actually came out to South Africa for that. And one of the ideas I stole from you guys was the idea of having a higher education enhancement committee, but specifically it was a forum of our deputy vice chancellors. I think you call them PVCs, we call them DVCs, for teaching and learning. And I was asked to convene a group of all of these DVCs for teaching and learning, at that time 22 universities. And as I said, highly unequal, some very high status institutions, some very poorly resourced institutions set up during apartheid for particular ethnic groups. And one of the first things that I did at that first meeting was to say, we are all colleagues and we will address each other by first names. Which was like, oh, shock and horror. Maybe not for you guys, but for us, it was shock and horror. And everyone has something to learn and everyone has something to contribute. And that's how we got going. And we did that twice a year for 5 years. And at the end, when the project itself was coming to an end and we were going to then, you know, regularize the approach rather than have it as a project, one of the DVCs from one of the less advantaged institutions, a very wise woman, nurse, very no nonsense, said, you know, when you set this up, I thought, oh no, it's going to be the same big brother, little sister kind of relationship. And it hasn't been. And she said, it's been fantastic that we are all here together as peers, each of us something to give, each of us something to learn. And after the project ended, they then continued to have their DVC network, and it continues now 5 years later.
That's fascinating. I do wonder, Andrée, whether there's parallels there with the Icelandic context, where you have big institutions and very small institutions. In that sense, does the enhancement approach offer some sort of equality across that landscape?
That is a very complex question, but I would like to start by saying that one very important feature of the way we work in Iceland is that because we are a national body composed of international people with no Icelandic members on the board, we feel that we feel in a very specific position vis-a-vis the whole sector. We feel that we need to be working with them to continue to cultivate their trust, to develop, whether it was when we went from QEF1 to QEF2 and now to QEF3, to develop all this in a partnership and a dialogue with the sector. And so far, we've been able to do that. And as evidence of this was the request from the university leadership to include the research management in QEF2, and now to agree to include another piece, the third mission in QEF3. So that really shows that they are not afraid of us. There is still an accountability dimension to what we do. And there are judgments of confidence at the end of the IWR reports. The way that this has been received in the sector has varied. So I should note that there are only, no, it's a lot actually, 7 universities for a rather small country. And some of those universities are really very tiny. They have like 200 students, but they still do research and they are all called universities. So in QEF1, the cycle ended up with 2 universities that had limited confidence. QEF2, we also had limited confidence judgments. The way the universities have reacted to this has really depended on their level of self-confidence. And their perceived capacity of coming up with a good action plan and a good development based on the recommendation they have received. So I would say that of the 7, 6 have really welcomed the enhancement orientation. The 7th is a bit more maybe hesitant and wondering whether we are pushing for standardization, pushing for one way of looking at all the institutions, which we cannot. As I said, there is one institution that has 200 students, and the biggest one has 15,000 students. We cannot hold them to the same standards in terms of the research activities and everything else. But nevertheless, we have to gain the trust of that one institution that is worried about what we might do to it.
So I guess that brings us to a really interesting question about how that shift or that kind of oscillation between the focus on enhancement and the focus on assurance, how that is shifting and why that is shifting in our specific sectors. I wonder if panelists, if you would like to offer any reflections on that shifting balance and maybe what's generating that and how that has shifted over the period that you've been involved. Padraig, again, could I come to you?
I mean, no more than the experience in the UK. When you start off this quality process, people want a baseline. They want, to go through a first run, and as Diane talked about earlier, very much a regulatory approach to make sure, which is the way, say, subject review started up. But once you've done a couple of rounds of this, maybe the margin that you get from doing things on a cyclical review basis diminishes. It's still important as a purely external system to have it, but really you probably get more value out of what happens on the annual basis. So I would argue that our biggest contributions to quality and the information that we do actually comes out of either analysing the institutional-led reports that departmental type reviews or the QQI analysis of the annual quality reports and the synoptic analysis and features of good practice, because there you get a picture on an annual basis. Otherwise, you're just dipping in on a 7-year basis. And to get a big picture of that, you have to go to the end of a cycle, and it can take an awful long time. So the trust kind of goes up after you've gone through the first initial cycles on both sides, because the institutions the first time around, but also on the regulatory side, say government and other funders, trust the thing a bit more once you've gone through a number of cycles. But we do feel that the annual reports and the annual information that we provides a much better and more granular picture than you get from just dipping in every 6 or 7 years.
That's really interesting. Diane, do you want to come in there?
Thanks. Before I could even wave my hand. So I mean, I think that that's a really good point. I do think one that needs a baseline, but one also needs some way of just checking that in a world that is rather turbulent and unsettled and very unstable, I don't think there can be an assumption that what was okay today or yesterday will still be okay tomorrow. There's corruption in our society particularly, but I don't think only. And there's things that drive people and institutions that are not necessarily always altruistic. So I think one does need to maintain this kind of balance between assuring quality and then enhancement. And so what we're going to do actually, I think is from 2024, from next year, I think it's going to be quite interesting. So there's a new quality assurance framework. They're not going to call them institutional audits anymore. They're going to call them institutional reviews. And that is taken from Scotland, actually. But the focus is going to be on making sure that an institution has a good, well-functioning, well-conceptualized internal quality assurance system. So putting more of the onus on the institution, but then just, going in and looking that this quality assurance system is not just on paper, but actually works. And then at the same time, working with the whole sector and saying, okay, what are we learning? What are our challenges? What do we need to address at sectoral level? So trying to achieve, I think, some balance between quality assurance and quality enhancement with much more control within the institution to come up with a quality assurance system that is best suited for that institution, given its particular context.
And is that something that you feel you have broad-based buy-in, or is it something that you're having to continually make the case for?
So one of the things that the Quality Enhancement Project did was it brought a far more enabling environment for conversations and inputs at the sectoral level, because we'd opened up that space. And what I didn't mention with the Quality Enhancement Project is we were very bold in not just having one enhancement theme. So the enhancement themes was something we also took from Scotland, but we didn't have one, we had 4 at the same time. So because we had to get the sector up quickly, we couldn't take 3 years per theme. So we were looking at enhancing academics as teachers, enhancing the student support, enhancing program enrollment management, and enhancing the learning environment. And we had little groups of people from every institution working on each one individually and in groups and nationally. And having done that for 5 years, people were much freer in the sector to contribute to the national conversations. And so the framework that I'm talking about now has had a lot of involvement and contributions and debate from the sector. So I think there's pretty broad-based support from the sector for this.
I see the raised eyebrows around the room at 4 enhancement themes at once. I know how much work goes in for one at a time, so that's fascinating. Andrée, would you like to come in on?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's a really interesting question, and perhaps what I would add to the contributions so far on this is I would see 3 factors in our case that have helped us hold on to the enhancement piece. First, when we recruit new board members, their commitment to an enhancement approach is absolutely essential. We will not take someone who is not totally committed to that kind of approach. The second piece is, and that has been alluded to already, is a firm belief that the primary responsibility for quality lies with the universities themselves. Otherwise, we end up with processes that are window dressing and are not really very useful. And the third piece is the partnership with the sector. And it's not only the very frequent contacts that we have with the student union and the university leadership and the quality officers, but it is also the commitment from governments. Because when you look at other countries, it's often that the shift toward more accountability than enhancement comes from the ministries, who are wanting more control and are dissatisfied with this and that, do not understand why giving responsibilities to the universities for their internal quality is useful. We've been very lucky in Iceland in having the main officers in the ministry with whom we interact are also very committed to this, have seen what damage can happen from having systems that are too control focused. So this has provided with a very good environment for us to continue to work in the same way.
That is really, really interesting. So I do wonder, there's a theme coming out about the kind of the size of the sector and how you're able to kind of keep that momentum going. And it's come up in your conversation, Andrée, and in Padraig, what you've been saying too about the size of the sector. I wondered if you had any reflections on that. Is it easier to maintain and drive an enhancement approach in a more tightly bounded sector, or is there something more flexible about that approach?
Well, I would say, if I can just continue, then it really depends. I'm very familiar with the Irish system, and I think the major difference between Iceland and Ireland is in the resources that are available. And the number of people in Ireland who are able to contribute to policy development, to data collection, to all sorts of things that support a quality system. In Iceland, it's not the case. There are so few people in the ministry, so few people in our own secretariat, so few people in the universities, that we have to make do with very little, actually. Yes, it helps to be small, because you know all the actors and all the actors know you and you can interact frequently, but at the same time you are missing some important pieces for a quality system.
Really interesting. Diane, I know you were itching to jump in there.
Yeah, so we have a population of about 60 million. But our university sector is fairly small. So we have 26 public higher education institutions with about 1.2 million students. And then we have about another 100 smaller HEIs. But I mean, the comment that was just made about people knowing each other is still true, interestingly, even though our sector is bigger, perhaps. So so there's the people in our National Department of Higher Education, the people in our National Quality Assurance Organization, and the people in the leadership of the universities, and the people at Universities South Africa all know each other, because people move around the sector in and out of positions. And so they all know each other, and some of them, like me, have been in the sector for a long time and have known each other for a long time. And so I keep coming back to the relationships, because I'm now convinced that in this world, relationships are actually one of the most important things. And if we have relationships with one another, regardless of whether we sit in government or in the quality assurance body or in an institution, then it's possible to have these broader conversations. And I think an enhancement approach is requires the relationships, as you said at the beginning, and the conversations. So I think the regulation, maybe the regulatory hard-nosed approach, maybe that's more likely in a place or in a country or in a system where there's this hard divide. The people in government are governing and the people in the institution or whatever. And if you can have that more fluid interaction among the various role players, then I think you can really promote enhancement in the sector.
Padraig, did you want to come in on that point at all?
Yeah, I mean, for the 6 years that I spent on the QAA Scotland Committee, one of the things that impressed me a lot was how Scotland really acts as a sector, even though you have universities of very different ages and very different, I suppose, international reputations and different emphasis and focus. You have institutions that are, world leading in research. The University of Edinburgh is ranked 29th in the world in the latest Times Higher. But you've also institutions, universities that are very much committed to widening access. And what I noticed in Scotland when I was there was that senior people in the research-oriented universities got involved in the process, because there was very much a tartan flag around the Scottish approach to things. I didn't see that, and I haven't seen that in the interactions with England, for instance, where really you don't tend to see the elite universities, and some universities you think they're more elite than some of the Scottish universities and probably aren't, but aren't involved in that. So that was something that I very much wanted in QQI to bring together as well, not to separate out the traditional university from what was the Institute of Technology or the technological university sector. I see a colleague of mine from South East Technological University. Diane was saying her institution's 100 years old. Aisling O'Toole there, her institution is less than 1 year old, has been amalgamated for. So having everybody in the room, I think, has made, you can be inclusive when you're small enough. It's much harder when you're bigger. And I mean, Scotland and Ireland are very similar, 5 million, 5.5 million, but 20-ish public or publicly funded institutions. So I do think that we're all this in together bit works very well, even where you have institutions that have very different emphasis in terms of international focus and research selectivity, etc.
Brilliant, thank you. So colleagues around the room, please do put any questions or comments that you have into the chat box. I've got a couple more quick fire questions I'd like to pose to the panel, and then I would like to open up for wider discussion. So please fire any questions into the chat box and we'll make sure we pick those up. So panelists, we're drawing to the end of our kind of my set of prompts for you all, but I wanted to ask, personally, in terms of your involvement with the Scottish Quality Enhancement approach, what's been the most valuable thing that you've gained from interacting with the Scottish Enhancement approach? Diane, can I come to you first on this one?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on the last comment about the sense of the sector working together. I was also tremendously impressed with that. So I mentioned I came out in 2013. I also came out in 2015, and I brought 14 deputy vice chancellors from South African universities with me. And we spent 5 days in Scotland and visited 10 universities. And we're very, very generously received. And again and again and again, we just saw that, whether you're Robert Gordon or Glasgow Caledonian or University of Edinburgh. Each university has a place, and each university has something to learn and something to give. And it's a sector working together, and that was tremendously impressive. And as I said, I did try to bring that in the relationships that we established with our DVCs, so that we're an unequal society, but we are equal in our importance. And I think that comes through so clearly in Scotland, equal in importance. And then the other thing that was tremendously important was to see the way Scottish universities work with students hand in hand. So, you know, there's some places in the world where students are considered customers, and I think it's horrible. And I really like the Scottish approach to students as partners. And when we visited universities, the student leaders, we didn't specifically ask to see student leaders, but the universities wanted us to meet student leaders, and the student leaders said again and again and again, it is our responsibility to work with the leadership of the university to ensure the best possible student experience. So I think that partnership is also tremendously impressive. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Andrée, I'll come to you. Just can we keep these comments brief so we can get to some questions from the audience as well? So what's the most valuable thing that you have taken, Andrée? Oh, you're on mute, Andrée. I thought
Sorry.
we were going to get through the
No, I'm the exception. Yeah, the enhancement approach, certainly the partnership with students, which is one of our foundational principles, the trust, the respect for institutional autonomy. All those things, I think, really are things that are deriving from the Scottish framework.
Padraig, what's been most valuable from your side?
You know, I flagged one part of it before, the inclusive nature for the institutions. I also like the idea that the enhancement teams were separately badged so that it didn't look like a QAA Scotland, that they were the secretariat, but that really people were saying this is the sector. And that's something that we've taken, you know, took for our National Academic Integrity Network, having a separate badging, and our National Student Engagement Programme, which was really born out of the experience of Spark. So the student participation, having students on panels, something we've had from a very early stage on programme validations and institution level evaluations. And, you know, that has worked very well in Scotland as well, I think.
That's fascinating to just hear what kind of sticks, what's been most valuable to you. I guess in the spirit of learning and sharing practice that we've really focused on here, I'd be interested in what you think the key lessons that the Scottish sector should be learning from your experience and what we should be taking forward from that. So I wondered, actually, Padraig, I wondered if I could come to you first on this one, particularly in relation to working as a tertiary education sector and building that into your enhancement framework. Is there anything that we should be thinking of as we step more rapidly down that pathway?
Well, we were established as an amalgamated body where we used to have separate agencies for further education, for university higher education, and for Institute of Technology or University of Applied Science, Polytechnic type education. When we were established legislatively, there was no separation of the wording between further and higher education. So within QQI, we've never had a further education unit or a higher education unit. Our review evaluations have been done by a tertiary education unit, and they start from the premise, as our legislation does, that no matter where you are, whether it's in school, in further education or higher education, the primary responsibility for quality is with the institution and the educators and the people that are standing up in front of people. And I think that has served us well. When we went to look at introducing institutional review in the further education sector, we used a similar model. We did them all at one time. And in fact, for what James Joyce would call a commodious vicus of recirculation, we went back really to the model that had been applied in Ireland by André's institutional evaluation program of having institutional reports, but a sectoral look at what was going, having a sectoral report that would evaluate those. And I think the institutions, particularly the further education institutions, were a bit scared at the start of saying, well, we're not universities, and I'm going, if we treated you differently, you would have said you wanted parity of esteem. So you still have the institutional responsibility. I think that's one of the things on the tertiary side that we can learn. I think one of the other, maybe this is a more salutary thing, I said Ireland and Scotland are around the same size. I really do think that having a more international focus on your panels would benefit the system. I don't like the idea that the international evaluator is an option. We have at least 2 international people and sometimes 3 on all of our panels. The 2 reasons cited for a challenge there are usually cost and training. I can assure you, having run this for a long time, that isn't one of them. You always learn something from someone who's from outside the system. That's always been my experience. So that might be, that's just a hint of something for you.
Really helpful. Andrée, I see you nodding along. What would be your thing that we should learn from the Icelandic context?
Well, I'd like actually to move away from the Icelandic context because, I mean, perhaps the major lesson in Iceland is because of limited resources, we have to focus on our core business. And there is a tendency, it is true, and it's been researched by sociologists, of any organization to want to grow and extend its power. We cannot do that. So that's really very helpful for our enhancement orientation. But I wanted to go back to something that Padraig was saying. He referred actually to the European University Association Institutional Evaluation Program. And so this evaluation instrument has been used in all sorts of contexts, whether national or institutional. For very, very large universities, for very small police academies, for art universities, all sorts of types of institutions. And basically, it is the same framework that's applied everywhere, because we start with what the institution wants to do, how it does, how it achieves its strategic objectives, how it knows that, how it monitors its activities, and what it does to change, what kind of new things that they do to change. So those 4 questions are actually fundamental to any evaluation instrument. And once any evaluation instrument is distilled to those 4 questions, you see they apply anywhere and everywhere, and for any type of institution, as long as as one respects the profile of the institution and its strategic objectives.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm just going to pause for a moment and come to Susie, who's been monitoring the chat and the conversations. Any questions that you'd like to pick up, Susie?
Martha, thank you very much indeed. I've been trying to restrain myself from putting too many questions in the chat, but there is one that I do have for all of the panelists. I've worked in small institutions and large institutions, and whenever I'm working with quality assurance officers, they have a great passion for enhancement, but often in their role, it's almost that they're struggling to do that because they are quality assurance officers. How do you think we can empower those absolutely key people, have such an impact on our institutions, very dedicated, and they have worked with me often out with their traditional 9 to 5, and when they've worked with me, we've been able to really make real change in our institutions, but it's almost through the back door when they're not doing the day job. And I want to know, I've always wanted to know, how can I empower these great people?
May I just respond to this? I'm very, very sensitive to this question. And I think there are two aspects to this. First, the profile of the officers. I don't know who they are in Scotland, but looking at this function and how it's been occupied by people around Europe, they are not always, the best people, the best profiled people to talk to their university leadership. But I think where we can help as quality assurance bodies is to make sure that we are looking at how embedded the quality processes are in decision making and how much the results are being used. Because most of the time they will end up working in a corner rather than at the center of the university, and they need to be placed in the center.
Brilliant. Diane, is there anything you'd like to comment on there?
Yeah, so it's and I think that's a very important point. They do need to be at the center, and they need to be seen to be at the center of the whole student learning experience. I had a very interesting visit a few months ago to Cardiff Metropolitan University, and the person there who heads quality, but she has a bigger portfolio than that, and she's actually physically broken down walls in the building between the quality office and their teaching and learning center, and they've integrated these two units so that it really is quality enhancement of the student learning experience and the educational provision. So I think it's some of that is conceptualization, and one can do that at the sector level with the leaders, and then one can do it with the people who are in that role. And also, I don't know if you guys have any formal qualifications that people take to become quality people in the sector, but I mean, that's another area for growth for CPD, and also for learning to get into that field in the first place.
That's fascinating, really interesting. Padraig, I'll give you an opportunity to come in if there's any top tips that you'd like to share on.
Just building on what Diane has said there, I think one of the things that really helps the quality officers, who can feel often like an internal auditor, that you're inside the system but you're viewed as outside, is exposing people like that to other people in the university who also have responsibility for quality but mightn't have it in their title. So the people in the academic registry who look at program monitoring and program approval, people, as Diana said, in the teaching and learning units, taking a much wider definition of that, there's a much greater chance. Otherwise, the quality officer tends to be seen as that guy or girl in the corner who organizes the reviews, and that's all. They need to be brought into the bigger conversation. The other utility, I think, that is you can feel as a quality director, as I did when I worked in Dublin City University, that you're alone. The peer group that you work with are very important. So giving people the opportunity at sector-wide level to learn from your peers, who will always have a slightly different way of doing things, simply because their institutions are different and varied. And you can learn an awful lot and don't end up reinventing wheels on it.
Wonderful. Colleagues, what a fascinating conversation, and we could continue to explore this further for much longer, I am sure. But I think we're going to have to begin to wrap up now. What a range of different metaphors we've had there, from not reinventing wheels to the actual as well as metaphorical breaking down of walls from Diane. But I think what I'm most struck by is the importance of relationships and conversations in really embedding enhancement in our institutions, in our sectors, but also in how we as individuals are working and championing change within within our everyday practice. So thank you, colleagues around the panel, for joining us today and being part of this conversation and helping step us through our thinking and thinking what's next for the Scottish sector, as well as reflecting back on the last 20 years. Colleagues around the wider table, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciated all of your attendance and your input to the discussion. A reminder that we have got a hugely rich set of conversations coming up over the next few weeks and months. So please do check out the 20 Years of Enhancement campaign programme and join us at an upcoming event that sparks your interest, and keep that conversation going. So panelists, colleagues, thank you so much for your participation today, and we look forward to seeing you at an event sometime very soon.